I started out this book, almost 20 years ago now. I've been writing about these issues. Before I started, I had been completely unaware of any of this. I knew nothing about this. I was teaching government politics in a university. I was interested in British politics and religious movements and radical ideologies, which may have been good background for what I ran into. But I knew nothing about family law or law at all, for that matter. I didn't know anything about social services agencies. I didn't know anything about social work industry. I didn't know anything about local government. I found all of this kind of, dreary, frankly. I didn't know, I heard the cliches about ugly divorce and nasty custody battle, and about domestic violence, and about deadbeat dads. And I'd heard about, I suppose I'd heard that courts were biased against fathers, and that courts would be guilty of sexism, and these are the cliches, and gender bias. But I never really, like most people, I didn't take a direct interest in this, or didn't understand it, and didn't have any interest in understanding it until I was forced to do it. And I found that the cliches, once I was entered into this world, this underworld really is what it was, I realized that the cliches were completely inadequate and misleading, and they didn't begin to convey the reality of what was taking place here. I had this image of divorce, which I think a lot of people still have. Two people decide to get divorced. They have increasingly friction, quarrels between them. They decide to divorce. They have a nasty divorce that if children are involved, there's an ugly custody battle. They get very angry with each other. They fight over the children. They fight over the money. They go to court, and everything's very ugly. Well, this didn't affect me. I'm not like that. I don't believe in divorce. I believe that if you made a vow, a commitment, a legal contract, or a sacred covenant, however you want to see it, that you were bound to that, both legally and morally, and that you should honor it. And that if you broke the contract or the covenant, you would be punished by the legal system. I knew that people could be. I thought that if you were adulterous, or if you leave the marriage without grounds, or if you beat your wife or whatever, or your husband, that you would be, the courts would be against you, and justice would be administered in the courts. Well, I was completely unprepared for what happened, and I found what was going on was a vast legal underworld of really not just judicial authority, but of political power that I had no understanding of whatsoever. I was just completely shocked at what was going on. And when I first realized what was going on, I began to contact. I come from a family background. My family was very liberal, left-wing. Both my parents worked for the government, for the U.S. government. I was taught to believe that the government officials, government functionaries were public servants and cared about the public good. So I would go and I tried to alert people in the civil liberties organizations, the famous American Civil Liberties Union. I called them up and I said, you can't believe what's going on here. And they said, oh, this is terrible, I agree. And then they ignored me. I contacted Amnesty International because I thought this was a civil rights, human rights violations were going on in these courts. And Amnesty International ignored me. And I contacted people in the media, the television and the radio and the newspapers. And I contacted people in the churches. I had no religious upbringing. I was not raised as a Christian at all. But I thought the church would be interested in this because, after all, churches marry people. So I thought the church would be interested in this. The church was not interested at all. So nobody seemed to be interested in this. And what I found, and what I explained to them what I had found, that this isn't just two people deciding to get divorced and then running into a ugly, nasty conflict. Most often, it's quite a different matter. The vast majority of divorces under the no-fault system are unilateral and involuntary. They are 80% in the United States are one party, usually files for divorce. The other party, the other spouse, usually has no knowledge of what is going on until they receive the petition. These things happen months in advance. One spouse usually is consulting with attorneys, is consulting with social service agencies. It's usually the mother when there's children involved. It's almost always the mother. She's almost always had contact with feminist organizations and social services, as I say, legal firms. Divorce is filed, it's unilateral by the father, by the mother usually, and the father, sometimes the mother, sometimes it's reversed, but usually the father is completely unaware of what is going on until he is served with papers. He might be legally unimpeachable, not only not guilty of any criminal transgression, but also not guilty of any civil transgression. And yet he still, I found that completely the innocent spouse can be, again, a completely legally unimpeachable citizen, a legally innocent citizen who's not even accused of any wrongdoing, can be taken to court, summoned to court. He can find that his marriage is dissolved. He can be evicted from his home. He can find all his property confiscated. He can find the most serious of all, he can find his children taken away, and he is deprived of any contact with the children. And he can even be in the United States. This has not happened in many other countries, but in Canada and in the United States, and in Britain it's starting now, he can also be incarcerated. He can be jailed without trial. And all of this can happen without any legal trial or any due process of law. I was shocked that this could happen. And again, I went to the media and to the civil liberties groups and churches, and nobody was interested. Nobody wanted to hear about this. So I felt like I was living in Kafka's novel. Of course, the trial. And I reread it, and everything very much rang true. I knew I had been. I quickly realized what advantage I had, I think, over other people is that I had been trained in politics, and so I quickly saw this not as a legal matter, but as a political matter. I could see that this transcended the legal principles that even I was familiar with. I mean, I knew that in the common law, there was a principle that you were not supposed to be summoned to court unless you've done something wrong. That's a basic principle of the common law. Thomas Hobbes, the most authoritarian political philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, even mentions this in his book Leviathan. He says, you cannot proceed legally against a man unless he's done something, he's transgressed the law in some way. Otherwise, you have a right under the common law to simply be left alone. Well, as far as I know, the divorce, so far, the divorce machinery, procedures are the only, and so far the only one, which transgresses this principle that an unimpeachable citizen has the right to be left in peace in his own home. Innocent people were summoned to court. And I suddenly, I could also tell that the very concept of no-fault justice, which I'd heard about, but I had no idea what no-fault justice meant. I thought it meant, and many people think this in the United States, many lawmakers, legislators, think this in the United States, that no-fault divorce means that two people can get divorced by mutual consent without any fault. It does not mean that. It means one person can unilaterally inflict the divorce on the other spouse and on the children without the consent of the other spouse. Okay, so it's not mutual consent, it's unilateral, involuntary divorce. So the completely innocent spouse can be forced into divorce and forced to accept the financial and the moral consequences of it without any compensation. So I knew that this concept of no-fault divorce was, or no-fault, I quickly realized that this concept of no-fault justice is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. You can't have no-fault justice. No-fault justice, it actually came it originated in auto insurance, car insurance. I don't know the background of this even now, but this is where it started. They took it from car insurance and they transferred it to marriage. I knew that there was a principle in the United States Constitution which said that no state, no government in the United States can pass a law which infringes the obligation of contracts. In other words, contracts must be enforced. Any legal contract that you and I make to buy a house, sell a house, or a car, it must be enforced. And yet here I could see that the marriage contract of all was simply abrogated, simply ignored, simply violated. Not simply not enforced by the state, but violated by the state. So common sense taught me that there was something, and plus my background in politics taught me that there was a fundamental political problem here. This was clearly interest groups and political power. This was a grab, a political power grab, not just a infringement of legal principles. So it was very clear that something serious was wrong here, and that no legal system, no legal system can exist with this way. And surely enough, the more I dug about it, the more I found that this concept of no-fault justice was poisoning the entire political system. I found that virtually every, as I described in the book, virtually every article of the American Bill of Rights is routinely violated in family courts. Freedom of association, freedom of speech, the prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures, the right of privacy, so-called, the right of due process of law, the right to be secure in your home. These are just routinely violated. I found instances where judges were gagging lawyers, gagging litigants, telling them that if you publish this, if you write about this, if you criticize the courts, if you go to the media, I will punish you. I will put you in jail or take away your children. I have examples of this in the book. This was astounding to me. Americans and British people had always prided themselves on their commitment to civil liberties and individual freedom, especially things like freedom of speech. I found instances where parents were told what religious services they could take their children to, or what religious services they could not take their children to. So basic freedom of religion was simply violated by these courts. Websites, internet sites run by fathers were being shut, were being closed by court order. In most courts, there is no record in the United States of the proceedings. There's no transcript of the proceeding. I found courts were closed, and the public was not permitted in, and the press, the media, were not permitted in, and even family members were not permitted into the courtroom. Okay, well, another basic principle of the common law is open justice. Open justice, openly arrived at. And these courts were they were secret. They were secret courts, basically operating without any record and without any open access. So clearly, what was going on here was much bigger than a few legal transgressions. It was clearly a political movement. I could see in areas like, again, domestic violence. I've heard about domestic violence. This is something, a cliche in the media all the time. I'd even used the phrase once or twice in my writings without realizing it. And yet I found that these domestic violence accusations were made without any due process. Domestic violence accusations were made in these courts all the time. They are usually, if they're punished by jail, it's usually only a few days in jail, because it quickly became apparent that the purpose of the accusations was not to jail someone for months or years, but to get control of the house and get control of the children. So the accusations would be made, the father would be thrown out of the home, he would be issued with a restraining order preventing him from seeing his children, he would be, or his wife or anyone, and then he would be, sometimes he would be put in jail for a few days just to keep him out of the house. And then he would be released and forced to attend a class or something like that, therapy. So it was quite clear there was an ulterior motive here. It wasn't just to punish a transgression, it was a ploy, again, to grab power and to use the divorce as a grab for power, a grab for the children, a grab for the property, and so forth. So I'd also heard about deadbeat dads, about fathers that supposedly hadn't paid their child support and how they had abandoned their children, and that they were, I would see these reports on television. They would show the police van would come, and they would round up 10 or 15 of these fathers in one morning, as if they were a big group of men that were all getting together in one room and conspiring on how not to pay their child support. And it didn't occur to me that something's wrong here. Why are they rounding up 10 fathers who haven't paid their child support all at one time? Are they sitting in the room together, discussing how not to pay child support? So, and then I realized what was happening. I could see the men being ordered to pay child support that exceeded their income, right? Or that 60, 70% of their income. But I also saw that they hadn't done anything to merit having to pay child support in the first place. My assumption was that child support was for men who had abandoned their children. Or they had at least agreed to divorce, right? So you agreed to divorce, the mother gets the children, you pay child support. Fair enough. That wasn't happening. They were taking the children from the men involuntarily. They had not agreed to a divorce. They had never failed to pay support their children in the first place. They had never done it. They were supporting their children in their own home like they were supposed to do. The children were taken from them, and then they were ordered to pay 50, 60, 70% of their income for children that they were already supporting in their own home. So clearly what was going on here was not irresponsible men abandoning their families. It was extortion. It was kidnapping, and people were using this term. Men were using this term, and I think they were right. They were saying the courts are operating a kidnapping and extortion racket. They're stealing your children and forcing you to pay for it. And they're exactly right. That's precisely what is going on. The courts seize your children and then demand that you pay. And if you don't pay the 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% of your salary, you are jailed. And there's no trial. And there's no sentence. You just stay in jail until somebody pays it. Or you bring out your credit card, or you borrow the money, or somebody, some neighbor or family member pays it. So this was obviously, madness. This was completely the opposite of what everything I believed about this. And so I couldn't help but write about this. I couldn't see, and I found that even the fathers, even the men who were involved in this, would use the cliches. They would talk about the courts were unfair. Well, the courts were more than unfair. Unfair is, life is unfair. The courts were seriously unjust. The courts were not just ignoring injustice, they were perpetrating injustice. They were themselves the authors of the injustice. They were not simply and the fathers were demanding oftentimes joint custody. They wanted to see their children. And I felt, well, you shouldn't just see your children. You should have, unless you've done something wrong. I assumed that as long as you obeyed the law and legal and civil codes, no one could stop you from seeing or being with your own children 24 hours a day or 7 days a week. What right does any government official have to prevent you from seeing your children at all, ever, unless you have done something wrong, legally? This is totalitarian. The idea that a government official can step in and just wave a piece of paper and say, you're divorced, therefore we have the right to take your children, and use the children as an excuse to take your income, and use that as an excuse to take you. It didn't take much for me to realize that this was not something bigger, much more intrusive, much more totalitarian, much more powerful than just prejudice against fathers, or sexism, or gender inequality. And this was the language many fathers groups used. They talked about sexism, and they wanted gender equality. They used the language of the feminist groups. Oh, by the way, the other thing I did was I went to the feminist groups, because I believed, and other men told me similar stories, I believed that the feminists had always said, well, men should take part in raising children equally with men. So, with women. So I went to the feminist groups and I said, look, did you know that this is going on here? And they said, oh no, we're shocked about this. This is terrible. And of course I realized that the feminist groups were not only, they were the ones perpetrating it. The feminist groups had created these family courts. They were the pressure behind the family courts. They were the pressure behind they had written the divorce laws back in the 1940s. They wrote the laws on domestic violence. They wrote the laws on child abuse. They wrote the laws on child support. And they were the social workers that were enforcing these. So the foxes were guarding the hen house. And I thought that the feminist groups would be on my side. I thought they would be sympathetic to what I was saying. My mother had a good friend who actually was a family court judge. And she was, at the time, she had been promoted. She was an appeals court judge. She was the second highest court level in the state where I was living, not the Supreme Court, but the next level down. And I went to her and I said, did you know what this is happening? This is shocking. And she said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But after a while, in a few minutes of conversation, I realized that she was part of it. She was part, so again, I felt like I was in in Kafka's novel, because everywhere I turned to get relief for this, they were part of the system. They knew what was going on already. So I felt like a fool. I felt so everything was turned upside down. The values that I was raised with of the liberal left and feminism and so forth were part of the problem. And this was what the book is about. So the book is it's about, the first chapter is on the no-fault divorce system, and then there's a chapter on the violation of the civil liberties, the civil rights, the violation of the Bill of Rights. And there's a chapter on domestic violence and child abuse, because I quickly realized that child abuse accusations were used similarly to domestic violence accusations against fathers and sometimes mothers as well. And then there's a chapter on the child support system, because that's the one I think the Europeans don't understand yet, because that's not as serious here in Europe as it is in America and Canada. That's the one where fathers are actually being put in prison indefinitely for years, and they never get out in many cases. And then there's a chapter on the feminists themselves and the ideology that was behind this and how this grew up over the decades. So you know, those are the major issues that I deal with in the book, and I don't know, is that a good start for a conversation?
Fair enough.
I will just mention too that my later book was occasion where I began to see that the same pattern that I saw in the family courts and with the divorce system, I saw in the larger society of what's going on in many other areas. Not only false accusations of domestic violence, but accusations of you know, rape in the universities and in the military, and now with these accusations of sexual harassment and so forth. The same modus operandi, the same patterns are emerging in much bigger areas, and so that's what that book is about.